ask you to please take your seats. Bobby, you can finish with the Congress up there. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the last panel of Saturday, the Unraveling of Syria, ? And to hand this over to Sam Brock. Sam has a very formidable last name. And he's going to brook no opposition in keeping discipline on this panel. But we also want to acknowledge him, I certainly do, together with my staff, for an extraordinary job of the orchestration of all of you getting to and fro in the most remarkable of ways. So I want to take this moment to thank our staff, Michelle, and Jesse, Cody, Zell, Sam, and everybody associated with this, because this kind of undertaking does not happen out of the sprung loose out of the head of Zeus. So if I can have a round of applause for the orchestra. And since it's only appropriate, how about one last roar for Heather?
My name is Sam Brock, and I am a member of this year's Epic Colloquium and will be moderating this evening's panel, The Unraveling of Syria. Over the past few years, the world has watched as the Syrian conflict has gone from being another bud in the Arab Spring to skirmishes and conflict to a civil war. People, as well as countries, have taken sides, either with or against the regime and each other. In the beginning, there was the Free Syrian Army, but over the course of the past year and a half, the opposition has splintered into various groups, various agendas fighting each other as much as they are the government. As nations have chosen sides in the Syrian war, unrest has built in the region and threatens to disrupt and tip already delicate balances in countries such as Lebanon and Jordan. It does not seem like we are on the brink of resolution either, and while the international community mobilizes, urgency grows exponentially for Syrians on the ground who have been forced to leave their homes and at times their country, and others who are afraid that they will be forced to do the same. In light of recent events in Geneva, it is unlikely that we will come to any conclusions or find any answers tonight to our questions about what the future holds in Syria. But hopefully by the end of the evening, we can at least feel comfortable that we are asking the right questions. As we begin, I would remind everybody that each of our speakers has been given 12 minutes to talk. There will be a timer to alert the speakers when they have 2 minutes remaining, indicated by a yellow light, and then when their time is up, which will be indicated by a red. I would ask the speakers to respect the time limitations so that we can engage the audience members with their questions. And to start, we have Ambassador Robert Ford, and he's going to be introduced by my classmate, Wen.
Good evening, my name is Wen Ho, and I'm a member of this year's Epic Colloquium. The Dr. John Mayer Global Citizenship Award was established in 1993 in honor of world-renowned nutritionist John Mayer. The award recognizes distinguished scholars and practitioners dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. Mayer epitomized the dedication to public service through his work with UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the National Council on Hunger and Malnutrition to expand domestic and international nutrition programs. Not only did he advise 3 US presidents, but he also served as the 10th president of Tufts University. While at Tufts, he founded this nation's first graduate school of nutrition, as well as New England's only veterinary school. Presented annually at our International Epic Symposium, this award recognizes distinguished scholars and practitioners dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. Ambassador Robert Ford, a career member of the US Foreign Service, embodies this leadership model. Ambassador Ford, who in fact retired from the Foreign Service on Friday, was nominated the US Ambassador to Syria in January 2011. Previously, he served as the US Ambassador to Algeria from 2006 to 2008, as well as the political counselor from 2004 to 2006, and Deputy Chief of Mission from 2008 to 2009 at the US Embassy of Baghdad. Since entering the Foreign Service in 1985, Ambassador Ford has also served at a number of other posts, including Izmir, Cairo, and Algiers. Before joining the Foreign Service, he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco. He has received a number of State Department awards, including the 2005 James Clement Dunn Award for Excellence in Military Corps Officers. We are incredibly fortunate and honored to have you here with us today, and on behalf of the Institute of Global Leadership, I'm very proud to present this award to you. Courageous, dedicated service, marked by the highest ideals of statesmanship, nuance, intellect, and integrity.
Thank you very much. I didn't come prepared with a speech, but the good news is there's a map on the award, and I have located Syria. So, thank you very much. This is my first visit to Tufts University, and my first visit here to the center, and it's a terrific pleasure. And thank you very much. I am not going to make a long speech now. I'm going to talk about Syria when there's the appropriate time, but I'd just like to say what a real honor it is to be invited to join this distinguished panel, and I look forward to a good discussion tonight. Thank you. Oh, so I thought, okay, we're going to start now. I just want to check the time mechanism. Okay. Sorry, it's an academic discussion, a little informal. So, yesterday was my last day working on Syria at the U.S. Department of State. It was my last day working for the U.S. Department of State as a Foreign Service officer. It was a delightful career. It was wonderful. If there are any of you who are considering it, I would urge you to consider it. I would urge you in the strongest terms to consider it. For me, it was a passion, and it was fabulous. But I also have to say that of all the issues I worked on, and I worked on some tough ones with colleagues like Muwafiq and Dr. Kirkuki in Iraq, but nothing was as heartbreaking ever as watching what has happened in Syria. Syria right now is on a really bad trajectory. Right now, the way this is going, the regime looks like it will consolidate its control over the western third of the country between Aleppo and Damascus and going to the Mediterranean coast. That's the way it's going. It's very difficult, and there's a lot of hard fighting, but basically the regime will hold that. But the regime does not have enough manpower to go into the north center and to the eastern parts of the country, to places like Raqqa in the north center, to Deir ez-Zor out closer to the Iraq border, or up into the northeastern part of the country where most of Syria's Kurds are located. The regime doesn't have manpower, and frankly, the regime is depending more and more on foreign fighters of its own, and they are not going to go to those places either. And so what we're going to have is a situation where the country is more or less de facto divided into different cantons, if you were, probably in some cases controlled by local factions. In the case of areas where the regime is controlled, pro-regime militias and in some cases military forces. It's important to note that the state itself, little by little, is collapsing even in places that the government holds because the government cannot afford its services, and so employees are not getting paid on time, and little by little state institutions are degrading. What is happening is it's so complicated, and I promise I will not go into banalities, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. It is multiple wars all at one time. It is a regional war pitting Sunni Arab countries against Shia Iran, whose ally is Bashar Bashar al-Assad, and there is no question that those Sunni countries that are helping the opposition in Syria in part hope to give a black eye to the Iranians, and in a sense they are bogging down a substantial portion of Iranian resources. There is also, on the regional side, there is a conflict even among the Sunni states for leadership. Saudi Arabia, Jordan on one pole, Qatar and Turkey on another pole, and it also divides very neatly into the southern front of the war and the northern front, Turkey, Qatar, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. But it's more than a regional competition. The regional powers simply exploit divisions that are very present in Syrian society, and it is very much a civil war. But it's a multifaceted civil war. Obviously, Alawis versus Sunnis, but don't forget, it's also an ethnic war. Kurds are fighting Arabs up along the Turkish border. There are now Christian militias fighting on behalf of the government. The Christian communities, in some cases, feel so threatened that they're now forming their own small militias. The bitter experience of the Christian community in Iraq feeds into their fears, and the very real presence of Tekfiri. How many of you know what Tekfiri means? Great. So the very real of these hardline, very hardline Sunni extremists, in many cases they're terrorist groups, is feeding the fears of not only the Christians but also the Alawis. And it is also a civil war because it is a fight over the Sunni identity in Syria. So you have secular factions fighting, you have Salafi, very conservative Sunni Islamists, very conservative. And then you have Tekfiris who are even more to the right of the Salafis. And in some places today in Syria you see Salafis fighting Tekfiris. That is what the fight is between the Islamic Front and the different elements of that and the Islamic State. It is so fractured that one Al-Qaeda faction, which is slightly less extremist than the hardest or the worst extremist faction, the Islamic State, you have one Al-Qaeda faction fighting another Al-Qaeda faction. That's how fragmented this is. One sharp sliver fighting another sharp sliver. In the middle of all of this, remember also that this civil war is a war of attrition. The Alawi community before the war was estimated to be somewhere around 3 million people. The Sunni community was estimated to be somewhere around 17, 18, 19 million people. In a war of attrition, how many of you would bet on that small minority? So what is going to happen as you look forward in a war of attrition is that the Alawis will suffer more and more manpower shortages, and they will depend more and more on foreign fighters to help them. And so you can already see this trend developing of a greater dependence by the regime on foreign support, even as there are more foreign fighters, and most of them extremists, I think, flowing in to help the opposition. So that the character of the entire Syrian uprising, which started very peacefully, I have to tell you, I was there, it started quite peacefully in 2011, has now turned into a multifaceted regional war and a civil war. I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes then on what can be done, and I hope we'll get into more detail. We, the United States, in the American administration, really spearheaded efforts to get to a peace conference. We worked our tails off on it, frankly, and I had a terrific team in Washington helping me with that. And we did manage to get the two sides to the table in Geneva in late January, and it got nowhere. And I have to be very honest about that, got nowhere. By the second round, they couldn't even agree on an agenda. Give you this little detail about it. Most of the discussions behind closed doors were the regime throwing out delegation and basically saying they weren't representative. The opposition delegation came with a plan for a transition government, and I know Ridwan has had a role in a lot of their thinking about that, and we can talk about that. Because I still believe that if you're going to avoid the future scenario that I talked about, the country being divided into sort of cantons with local warlords in many places, you really are going to need some kind of a transition government. But to get to a transition government, you're going to have some elements of the regime that stay, because the Alawites are terrified. Christians are terrified, remember what I said? But you're going to need a lot of change in that government too. You're going to have to bring in a lot of new faces. And remember, if you're fighting the regime, you can't go home again if the intelligence services are unchanged, because they will come to your door at night and they will take you away. So there's going to have to be change in those services too. There's also going to have to be some kind of resolution to the Syrian Kurdish grievances, and they are serious and they are many. And it's something that my colleagues in the Syrian opposition have been a little reluctant to acknowledge at times, but it almost exploded on us in Geneva, and it is going to have to be dealt with. How do you manage not only the Kurdish ethnic minority, there are other ethnic minorities in Syria too. So you can see how tough this is going to be. And I don't know if we're going to get to a Geneva round 3 anytime soon. We'd at least have to get an agreement on an agenda, which we don't have now. So I bring no good news to you tonight about Syria. I wish I did. But I'm hoping that in the discussion tonight, perhaps we can at least theorize some paths out. So let me close there.
Next, we'll hear from Mr. Navid Boulos, who is a special correspondent in the Middle East for the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, Hartford Courant, and the Aberdeen American News.
Well, good evening. I'm going to have to agree with Ambassador Ford on this. There's nothing good about Syria. In fact, I would go so far as to say the question of the unraveling of Syria has been settled. It has unraveled. Let me give you some background on who I am and what I've been doing. I'm basically Jordanian, and in fact, back in the day, I would travel back and forth from Jordan to Lebanon. In fact, I would cross by taxi. It was a 3-hour ride. Now, this idea is totally fantastical. To go from Amman by taxi over to Beirut is a ridiculous notion, and it's basically a death sentence. Essentially, what we have now, and if I try to map the opposition groups in charge, the military groups, it will become like a bad soap opera very quickly. We're talking about effectively 30 different groups on the one side, and then they come under different umbrella groups, and then they vie for control in different sections. Essentially, at best, what we're going to be after, I think, is what I've been calling the Lebanonification of Syria. And that's the best case scenario, which is to say that we'll have de facto cantons of different sects with people who are essentially warlords. This is not a good thing. Syria, despite the fact that it was, of course, that it has a very repressive dictatorship and all these other things, nevertheless, it was a country, right? What remains now is not anything like a country. And more importantly, we're talking about what I would call the most important country in the Middle East. My parents and that generation were always complaining about Egypt and how it had lost its primacy in the Arab world and how it really was the leader of the Arab world. I've always disagreed with that notion. I've always felt that Syria was a far more important country, if only because, and of course, this is all due respect to my Egyptian friends, but I've always felt that Syria was more important, mostly because it borders Israel, it borders Turkey, it borders Iraq, it borders these countries that are really vital in every way, and we're seeing the effects of the problems in Syria already. Jordan, economically, is suffering, of course, but even more importantly, in terms of water. Zaatari camp, which is the 4th largest city, mind you, this is a camp, it is now the 4th largest city, lies atop of the largest aquifer in the country. And Jordan, by the way, is the 4th poorest country when it comes to water resources. So imagine, We're talking about a refugee camp, and the deal was that they would bus out the waste, but now what's happening is that you have direct drilling into that aquifer, so this water source is contaminated. This is a catastrophe waiting to happen. Now, that's just one part of it. This is ignoring the huge amounts of refugees in what's known as the urban setting, which, by the way, is highlighted in Lebanon, which refuses to actually create proper camps because they're afraid of having Palestinians, well, I should say, repeating the Palestinian situation. Similarly, go back into Syria itself. I was there 2 weeks ago, in fact, and I had gone a few months before into the Yarmouk camp. Yarmouk, by the way, was the largest grouping of Palestinian refugees. To call it a camp is to sort of misunderstand the nature of camps that are involved at this point. It was more like a mini city as well, with streets. It became a place effectively for low-cost housing. I guess the way to think about it is like the projects that you would find in Baltimore or Philadelphia. I was there when you had children holding AK-47s and shouting at each other across walls, literally 10 meters apart. And instead of, I mean, of course they would curse as we always do when we're kids, you know, you blah, 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 I'm gonna do this to you. But, I mean, instead of having rocks and water balloons, they had AK-47s, and the danger was real of death. And I was there 2 weeks ago when they started bringing out the people, finally brokering these mini local ceasefires. Of course, this is not to mention the ongoing battle right now in the Qalamun area, a mountainous region between Lebanon and Syria, which was a major smuggling area, and now is the staging ground of the latest offensive featuring Hezbollah and other groups. So we are essentially seeing, as Ambassador Ford said, a multifaceted catastrophe. Now, obviously, I'm not giving you guys any hope, and rightly so, there's very little hope to give. Because also, beyond that, if we talk about the efforts to bring in the different factions on the ground for Geneva, I mean, despite the Herculean effort to bring this conference to fruition, you have groups like the Islamic Front, which is in theory the largest fighting force on the ground at the moment, outlawing anyone going there and saying that they would prosecute anyone going to this conference in the Sharia court. So this is obviously a problem. Then you have other groups like ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, operating up in the north. And I mean, to put this into some perspective, they are so crazy that Al-Qaeda said, we don't want you guys part of Al-Qaeda. This is not a comforting point of view, clearly, right? And in fact, because we have to be realistic about what we're dealing with, Nusra Front, which initially was vilified as the Al-Qaeda bogeyman, is now considered to be somewhat moderate. I mean, you will hear people who will tell you that it's a somewhat moderate group, and they're good guys. So, and also, now more importantly, we're seeing the establishment of chokehold sieges across different areas of Syria, like Homs, like in Ma'tamiyya, in Bazeh, etc. And this tactic, which actually has finally given a result in the last, I would say, 3 weeks or so, is essentially starving the opposition into submission. Now, it's called, somewhat euphemistically, a reconciliation movement. Perhaps you could call it capitulation, the argument can be made. Now, obviously, this is not a uniform situation across different areas. Some areas, actually, for example, in Bazeh, which is a neighborhood in Damascus, there have been perhaps real moves towards a reconciliation where you have what's known as the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, and army units, especially the NDF, the National Defense Force. I told you it's going to get weird, but yeah, don't worry, it'll get worse. Sort of brokering these local ceasefires and working together in manning the different checkpoints. Then, for example, you have an old Homs. Homs is a strange place because Homs is an area with a Sunni majority, and actually it was a gorgeous city back in the day. Now, Homs, if you go to an area called Khali, which borders old Homs, that area is essentially leveled. I've used the word decimated, and the word decimated in its literal meaning, by the way, means 1 out of 10. And truly, 1 out of 10 buildings are sort of standing, whereas the rest of it is completely rubble. Now, Old Homs has been surrounded by the army for about 2 years now. There were some attempts to bring in aid. Finally, the UN was able to broker a deal whereby children and older people, so between people under the age of 15 and under the age of 55, were able to leave under UN control, under UN protection, sorry. And then they found, suddenly, and we were there when this happened, that they had streams of fighting age men coming out at the same time. They were willing to risk what was going to happen to them by the government, and by the way, the different pro-government militias, effectively, what's known incorrectly by the way, it should be how, but we can use that as a shorthand term for them. They're willing to risk that as opposed to staying inside old homes where the situation in terms of food and nutrition and services and everything else have become so dire that you have people supposedly eating grass. So, obviously the situation is not good. I would wager, in my opinion, I have to say, and this is said with all due respect to all the efforts that were done by so many other people, that I don't think Geneva 2 or 3 or 4 or 4 million is going to do much at this point, only because the government has no reason to change its calculus. The government, if the force on the ground is not changing, then the government will inexorably win. Will it ever get control again over areas it has lost? Eventually, I would say even that, yes. And even if it doesn't, even if by virtue of activating these local proxy forces, and there are many, including NDF, including Shabiha, including the Liwa of Tahrir Iskandarun, many other areas, all these local players will, of course, want to retain control. And if they actually do end up doing that, then the government, right, the government will nevertheless have some semblance of control over them. Possibly, they won't be able to have these sort of hegemonic, sort of big brother situation they had in the past. That's true. Maybe Hask is lost. Maybe let's say parts of Raqqa are lost forever. This is all possibly Aleppo. But even Aleppo, which was sort of the stronghold of the rebels, where they had endless support coming in from the border across Turkey, even there the battle is being lost. So I would say the hope going forward, if there is such a thing at this point, is in the strengthening and in the relying more and more on these local mini ceasefires that you're seeing happening in Berzeh and Ma'bani and different places. Now, we also have, by the way, a model of how these reconciliations failed in Tarkanah, which was a village bordering between Lebanon and Syria. It was touted in the beginning, maybe a year into the revolution, as the future of what would happen. That clearly did not come to pass. Tarkanah has clashes all the time. It's a place where you have, it's a Potemkin village, in other words. And clearly, that's not the way to go forward. You need to have ironclad guarantees of the safety of these people. You'll probably need to have some kind of proper amnesty for most of these people as well. And of course, now we turn to the other idea of the ramping up of arming for the different groups on the ground, the opposition. So the states, America was on the way towards arming these groups in August, and of course the strike. And then we saw a pivoting away, to use Mr. Burns' words from yesterday. And now there's a change back again towards going to arm one more time. And efforts have been focusing on what's known as the Southern Front, the area bordering Jordan and Syria. And the idea there is that the rebels there are more moderate. In fact, that's a word that's being used very often lately, moderate. And the fact is, it's too broad a word. We don't even know what it means at this point. I cannot tell you what a moderate person is. I don't think the concept of religion, Islamist, Salafist, jihadi, etc., I don't